Those protests are in their second month now, and they're taking place inside and outside of Iran. So to talk more about how this started and where it could go, I want to welcome Christiane Amanpour. She is CNN's chief international anchor and host of Amanpour. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
You know, it's extraordinary to see what is happening in Iran, especially for someone such as you, who's watched what's been taking place there for decades. How did the death of one woman, Mahsa Amini, 5 weeks ago, spark so much international protest?
Well, look, I think you have to separate the international from inside. The international, of course, is the diaspora, and they are free to protest, and they have come out in support. What's really extraordinary is what's going on inside Iran, and that this death of this one woman triggered 43 years of pent-up, anxiety and anger, and they've kind of had enough, the Iranian women. At least that is what they're saying, that we can all hear. And the death of this young girl, her story was so poignant because she was a Kurd. Her family was Kurdish. They came down from, their area of Iran up in the northwest to visit family. And as she was coming out of one of the metro stations, she was jumped upon by these morality police officials. And whatever happened to her, whether she was roughly manhandled as they bundled her into a vehicle, took her to the so-called morality police station, or whether she was roughed up there, the pictures that then emerged from her hospital bed showed that she had been assaulted. And she has basically died in police custody. That is a fact. She was in the custody of morality police, and they were responsible for her. So I think that death of a woman, a young woman, Gen Z, who was simply, and you could see that she was wearing her headscarf and the loose covering, just was too much for the young generation of women and indeed their male allies in Iran.
You know, you just touched on this, and of course, when you're saying decades of pent-up frustration to a degree, we have seen protests in Iran before, most notably after the 2009 election. So what makes this so different?
Well, look, we're going to wait and see, to be honest with you. It's hard to tell where exactly this will end up. So far, what's slightly different is that it's lasting longer than the previous ones, that the sort of coalition of those who are out on the street is broader than the previous ones. It's not just young girls. It's not just women. It's not just more modern women. It's even more conservative, traditional religious women who are marching alongside girls who have taken off their headscarves. And it's also young men and other men too. This is a broad coalition of people, of ordinary citizens, who believe that no matter what kind of government they have, whether it's an Islamic Republic or not, that their personal freedoms, what they choose to wear, is not up to the government. That in fact, this regime has said that they need to dress modestly. It never really codified the hijab. And if you go all the way back to 1979, when the Islamic Revolution happened, there was no hijab. There was no mandatory hijab at the beginning. It was only afterwards that the Ayatollah Khomeini insisted. And that's when actually that generation of women went out on the streets and said, no, we protested for you against the Shah's regime to bring us freedom and democracy. You're not going to put us back in the hijab, which of course they did. So this has been, it's been a problem for a long time. And I will say that the current president there, Raisi, he made women's, personal politics, if you like, the politics of their personal demeanor, their clothing, how they're allowed to go around in public, a central plank of his campaign. And he has empowered the morality police in a way that it wasn't empowered by the previous president or by the other so-called reform presidents. And I think that that's something that people should understand. This is not codified in law, the fact that this morality police can go around, roughing up, beating up. And frankly, you've seen that live fire, that batons, that all sorts of very violent tactics have been used by the regime in this instance.
And speaking of Raisi, you have experienced in your own way the suppression of the regime, and that was just last month. Take maybe you can take us through in part what happened at the UN and what that episode really said to you.
Well, I had an interview with Raisi at the UN, so note, in New York, not in Iran. And I have interviewed many, many Iranian presidents, both inside Iran and outside. When I'm inside Iran, of course, I have to abide by the law, like all international journalists do. And they say you have to wear a hijab, so we do, which is basically the headscarf. Outside Iran, I have never ever had to accommodate their laws or rules or customs on dress. So I was really surprised when I was sitting down waiting for President Raisi to arrive. And remember, this is just as the news of the death of Mahsa Amini is filtering out, just as the protests are beginning to start. So of course, it was an exclusive interview that I wanted to conduct. But his aides came to me, 5 minutes before or half an hour, whatever, before the interview. We were sitting down, ready, everything was lit. And they said, well, the president suggests that you wear a headscarf. And I said, well, why? Because I've never, ever done that before. It's not mandatory. It's not the law where I am here in New York. It's not the it's not the Iranian embassy or anything like that. I'm in a free country with no obligations. And it's unprecedented. I've never been asked before. But they kept insisting. And I, in the end, had to say no. And by the way, this was a journalistic principle that I stood up for. It had nothing to do with politics. It actually had nothing to do with what was going on in Iran. I just knew that as a Western journalist working for an independent and democratic organization in a free country, that I was not going to ever allow a foreign government or any government to tell me how to behave and certainly not what to wear. And that's what happened. I had to let go of an exclusive interview.
And while we're watching, of course, all of this play out in Iran, there's also the situation unfolding in Ukraine. And we've seen the Iranian regime, flex its muscle internationally as well when we're talking about the reports of the regime supplying drones to Russia that killed Ukrainian civilians. So how can that be connected to the unrest at home?
Well, I think in the big picture, the Iranians have a close cooperation with Russia, and it played out in the war scenario in Syria, as you remember. The Iranians were the foot soldiers and the ground forces for President Assad as he tried to tamp down this huge rebellion that was happening in his country during the Arab Spring. So the Iranians, all their militias, Hezbollah, they were Assad's army on the ground, and the Russians came in and were Assad's air force in terms of bombarding civilian structures, cities. All of that was going on. And the Russians were also Assad's voice in the Security Council. So the two of them have this kind of long history. And now Iran is supplying drones, kamikaze drones to Russia. This is according to U.S. intelligence and what they've seen in terms of sales and their intelligence has sort of seen what's going on. The Iranians deny it, the Russians deny it, but the U.S. says that it's happening. And what we can see is a very new brand of these drones that, to as far as we know, only Iran has them. These big, lumbering kamikaze drones, which are deadly, are being deployed now by Russia in Ukraine. So what's the connection here? In short, both these countries want to put down a free people. So Russia does not want to see a free and independent, westward-leaning, democratic Ukraine because it would raise questions amongst Russians about why they, next door, don't have the same free, democratic, open politics in their own country. And Iran doesn't want to see its people free, democratic, and rebellious, demanding basic human and civil rights. So they share right now a sort of a joint commitment to repression. And I think that's part of the reason. Of course, Iran also wants money, and it's selling its weapons, and it has a defense cooperation with Russia. But of course, it wants to have its cake and eat it too, because the Iranian foreign minister said today, we actually support the territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. Wow. The drones that they are selling are killing Ukrainian civilians.
And very finally, I wanted to ask you about some of the pressures that have come down since all of this, and of course, involving the war in Ukraine. More sanctions have been announced against the regime, including from Canada, the United States, the European Union in recent days. Iran has been navigating sanctions for decades, more than 40 years. So in your view, what is the effectiveness of sanctions against the backdrop of these protests?
Well, look, it's hard to tell. You're right. Iran has been sanctioned. There are practically no more sanctions that you can put on Iran for the last 40 years, basically, of the revolution. And increasingly, they have mounted. And you can see that they have been able to withstand, in their own way, these sanctions in terms of the repressive the repressive organs of the Iranian regime. Now, it's true, though, that the sanctions have made it very difficult for ordinary Iranians. And so the high inflation, the cost of living there has also propelled people onto the streets because they've really had enough. For many of them, it's hand to mouth. For many of them, it's multiple jobs just to keep body and soul together. Of course, as you know, every war economy favors the few. And so there are many, rich people in the regime and close to the regime, but the ordinary people are suffering, which is another reason why they're out on the streets. I have heard from many people who I've been interviewing, including the Iranian Nobel laureate Shireen Ebadi, who said that eventually democracy will come to Iran through the gateway of these female protesters and this Gen Z generation that just can't tolerate this suffocation anymore. In terms of Russia and Ukraine, I think what we really have to see and we have to know whether NATO is willing to give Ukraine all the help that it can to defend itself and to win, not just to avoid it losing. And that's something we're seeing a real turning point right now, a real critical moment as Russia, with its new battlefield commander in Ukraine, resorts to the kinds of tactics that it did in Syria and before that in Chechnya, as you know, which is trying to crush to rubble civilian structures and trying to force civilians and therefore their government into surrender. And the Ukrainians say that will never happen, but they need the air defenses, they need all the things that the NATO is promising them to be able to survive. Because as NATO has said, this is not, and as your prime minister and the president of the US and everybody have said, this is not just another battle. This is one in which democracy, international law and order, rules of the road, human rights, all of that is at stake. All of the things that we have been raised to believe are important in this world.
Well, thank you so much for your valuable insights today. We appreciate it. That is Christiane Amanpour in